Welcome back to Beyond the Scoreboard. Every day, people make decisions about who they will follow. Athletes decide whether they trust a coach. Students decide whether they respect a teacher, or employees decide whether they believe in a leader. Children decide whether they imitate a parent, and communities in general decide whether they support a vision or not. It happens so naturally that we rarely stop to think about it. Yet, one of the most fascinating questions in sport and in life is surprisingly simple. Why do people follow? At first glance, the answer appears obvious, though. People follow leaders. They follow coaches, teachers, managers, parents, and mentors because those individuals occupy positions of authority. The coach leads because they are the coach. The teacher leads because, well, they are the teacher. The principal leads because they are the principal. Yet, experience suggests something far more complicated. Most of us have encountered individuals who held positions of authority but possessed very little influence. We listened because we had to. We compiled because circumstances required it. We followed instructions because rules demanded it. But we didn't truly follow, did we? At the same time, many of us have encountered people who held no official positions at all, yet influenced us deeply. Their opinions mattered, their actions inspired us, their example challenged us. Long after our interaction with them ended, their influence remained. This raises an important question. If leadership is not simply about position, what is it about? The longer I have been involved in coaching, the more I convinced that I have become that people do not primarily follow titles. They follow trust. This distinction changes everything. Titles can create authority. No, authority can create compliance, sure, but trust creates influence, and influence is where genuine leadership begins. Think about the most influential coach, teacher, mentor, or leader you have ever known. What made them influential? Most people do not begin by describing technical knowledge. They rarely start by discussing credential, achievements, or awards. Instead, they tell stories. They remember conversations. They recall moments when someone believed in them, challenged them, supported them, or helped them navigate difficult circumstances. What remains memorable is rarely information. What remains memorable is influence. This observation reveals something important about human nature. People want to know whether they can trust the person leading them. They want to know whether the leader's actions match their words. They want to know whether the leader genuinely cares about those they serve. They want to know whether the leader's decisions are guided by principles rather than personal ambition. In other words, they are evaluating character. Character may be one of the most underrated elements of leadership. Modern discussions often focus on skills, strategies, communication techniques, and organizational systems. All of these matter. Effective leadership requires competence. Good intentions alone are not enough. Yet competence without character creates a significant problem. History is filled with talented individuals who possessed extraordinary abilities but used those abilities poorly. Knowledge alone doesn't guarantee wisdom. Skill alone doesn't guarantee integrity. Influence alone doesn't guarantee positive leadership. Character acts as a compass. It determines how influence is used. It shapes decisions. It guides behavior when nobody's watching. Perhaps this is why people are often drawn to leaders whose lives reflect consistency. We trust individuals whose actions align with their values. We respect people who remain grounded during success and steady during adversity. Trust grows when words and actions agree. This is true in coaching. It is true in teaching. It is true in parenting and in leadership. One of the interesting realities of coaching is that athletes are consistently evaluating whether a coach is authentic. They may not articulate it directly, but they're paying attention. They notice how coaches respond after losses. They observe how coaches treat individuals who are not stars. They watch how coaches handle mistakes, adversity, and conflict. Athletes often learn more from what coaches do than from what coaches say. The same principle applies beyond sport. Children learn from watching, employees learn from observing, communities learn from example. Leadership always teaching something, whether intentionally or unintentionally. This is one of the reasons leadership carries such responsibility. The question is not whether people are paying attention. They are. The question is what they are learning from us. Another factor that influences followership is sacrifice. This may sound unusual in a culture that often associates leadership with power, status, and privilege. Yet many of the leaders who leave lasting impressions are remembered not for what they gained, but for what they gave. They invested time, they invested energy, they invested attention, they invested themselves in the development of others. And people recognize sacrifice. They recognize when leaders are willing to carry burdens on behalf of others. They recognize when leaders are willing to accept responsibility rather than assign blame. They recognize when leaders place the needs of the group ahead of personal recognition. This kind of leadership creates trust, and trust creates influence. Faith has profoundly shaped how I think about this idea. One of the most countercultural concepts within faith is that leadership is not primarily about being served, it's about serving others. At first glance, this idea seems backwards. The world often presents leadership as a pathway toward greater power, visibility, and recognition. Faith offers a different perspective. Leadership becomes stewardship. Leadership becomes responsibility. Leadership becomes service. Rather than asking how many people work for me, the question becomes how many people am I helping? Rather than asking how much influence do I possess, the question becomes how am I using the influence I have been given? This perspective changes the entire conversation. Success is no longer measured solely by achievements. It's measured by impact. Influence is no longer measured by popularity. It's measured by contribution. Leadership is no longer measured by position. It's measured by service. Perhaps this explains why some individuals remain influential long after their titles disappear. Their influence was never dependent upon position in the first place. It was rooted in character, consistency, trust, and service. The greatest leaders often leave behind something far more valuable than accomplishments. They leave behind people who are stronger because they were present. Former athletes become better leaders. Former students become better teachers. Former employees become better mentors. The influence continues long after the original relationship ends. That's leadership at its best. As we close today's episode, I want to leave you with one final question. Why do people follow you? Not your title, not your position, not your accomplishments. You. What is it about your character, your actions, your consistency, and your service that encourages others to trust you? Because leadership begins long before someone receives a title. Leadership begins when a person becomes worthy of trust. And perhaps that's the answer to the questions we began with. Why do people follow? Not because they are forced to, not because they have to, not because they have discovered someone they trust enough to follow. That's something to think about. Thank you for joining me for episode 5 Beyond the Scoreboard. Until next time, continue pursuing excellence, continue investing in people, and remember that some of life's most important lessons are found beyond the scoreboard.